The prison ship dropped out of hyperspace above a world that looked like it was made of rust and blood. And Commander Marcus Cole pressed his face against the tiny viewport to get a better look at the planet that would probably kill him. 3 weeks ago, he had been leading a diplomatic mission to establish first contact with the HFY Dominion. And now he was just another piece of cargo being delivered to their homeworld. Like a package of meat, the guards came for him an hour later, their massive reptilian bodies filling the corridor as they dragged him from his cell and pushed him toward the transport shuttle. Marcus had learned a few things about the HFY during his captivity, and none of it was good. They stood 8 feet tall, with scales as black as deep space, and eyes that glowed like embers in a dying fire. And they had conquered 17 star systems through pure military might. Their culture was built entirely around combat and honor, and the ancient traditions of their warrior ancestors. And they viewed every other species in the galaxy as either potential slaves or worthy opponents. Humans had not yet proven themselves to be either. The shuttle descended through clouds of orange dust and landed in a city that stretched across the horizon like a monument to war, with towers shaped like blades and streets wide enough for armies to march through. Marcus was hauled out of the shuttle and thrown to his knees before a creature even larger than the guards. A HFY wearing ceremonial armor decorated with the bones of fallen enemies. "I am Overseer Krathvalum," the creature announced in a voice like grinding stone, "and you have been selected for the trial of worth." Marcus looked up at the Overseer and tried to keep his voice steady as he asked what that meant. The Overseer's lipless mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, revealing rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. "It means you will fight for the freedom of your people, human, and you will almost certainly die in the attempt." They took him to a holding area beneath a massive arena, a pit of stone and metal where prisoners from a dozen different species sat waiting for their turn to face death. Marcus found his people there, the 43 civilians who had been captured alongside him when the HFY boarded their diplomatic vessel. There was Dr. Sarah Chung, the xenobiologist who had spent her whole career dreaming of peaceful first contact with alien species. There was Thomas Webb, the engineer who had brought his 12-year-old daughter on the mission because he wanted her to see history being made. There was little Maya Webb herself, who had stopped crying days ago and now just stared at the walls with empty eyes. Marcus knelt beside them and promised that he would get them out of this, even though he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. The rules of the trial were explained to him by another prisoner, an insectoid creature from a world the HFY had conquered centuries ago. There would be 3 challenges, and Marcus would have to survive all 3 to win freedom for himself and his people. The first challenge was combat, a fight against a HFY champion in the ancient arena above. The second challenge was endurance, a test of physical limits in a place called the Scorching Halls. The third challenge was will, which the insectoid refused to describe, except to say that no outsider had ever passed it. "Who is my opponent?" Marcus asked, and the insectoid made a clicking sound that might have been laughter or might have been pity. "Valith Sambane," the creature answered, "the greatest warrior the Dominion has produced in 300 years, undefeated in over 500 trials, blessed by their war priests as the living embodiment of HFY supremacy." Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath and thought about all the ways this situation could not possibly get any worse. The arena above them roared with the sound of 50,000 HFY spectators, their voices rising and falling like thunder as some poor soul met their end on the sanda. Guard came to collect Marcus an hour later, fitting him with basic armor and handing him a weapon that was little more than a metal rod with a sharpened end. "You face the champion tomorrow at sunrise," the guard informed him. "And you should know that the Overseer has wagered heavily on your death, being both swift and entertaining." Marcus gripped the weapon and looked at the guard with eyes that held no fear, only a cold determination that seemed to confuse the massive reptile. Tell the overseer I planned to disappoint him. That night, Marcus sat alone in his cell and thought about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about Earth and the home he might never see again. He thought about humanity's journey to the stars, the centuries of struggle and sacrifice that had carried his species from one small planet to 100 colonies scattered across the galaxy. He thought about his grandmother's stories of survival, of ancestors who had walked through fire and ice and horror and somehow kept going when every logical calculation said they should have given up. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the fastest or the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but they had something that Marcus was beginning to understand. The HFY had never encountered before. They had the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was the only rational outcome. The sun rose over the arena the next morning, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like the whole world was burning. Marcus walked out onto the sand and looked up at the screaming crowds and felt something strange happening in his chest. It was not fear. Although fear was certainly there beneath the surface, it was something older and deeper, something that his species had carried with them since the first humans stood up on two legs and decided to face a world full of predators instead of running away. Across the arena, a gate opened and Valeth Sunbane stepped into the light. She was magnificent in the most terrifying way possible, her black scales gleaming like polished obsidian and her ceremonial blade catching the sunlight as she raised it toward the crowd. The spectators chanted her name like a prayer, and she drank in their worship like it was water in a desert. Then her burning eyes found Marcus across the sand, and she smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Marcus raised his makeshift spear and smiled back at her. And somewhere in the crowd, an alien spectator turned to their companion and asked why the small human was baring his teeth at the champion like he thought he had any chance of surviving. The horn sounded to begin the trial. Marcus charged forward to meet his fate. Valeth Sunbane moved like water flowing downhill, smooth and inevitable and completely impossible to stop. Her ceremonial blade whistled through the air where Marcus had been standing half a second before, and he felt the wind of its passage against his cheek as he threw himself sideways and rolled across the sand. The crowd roared with delight at the near miss, and Valeth pressed forward with another strike that would have taken his head clean off if he had not ducked. At the last possible moment, Marcus had known from the start that he could not win this fight through skill or strength or speed. The HFY champion was better than him in every measurable way, trained since childhood in the art of combat, while Marcus had spent most of his career sitting behind desks and staring at star charts. But humans had been fighting things bigger and stronger and faster than themselves since the dawn of their existence, and they had developed certain strategies for survival that the HFY had never needed to learn. He ran. The crowd hissed with disapproval as Marcus sprinted away from Valeth and put as much distance between them as possible, weaving between the stone pillars that dotted the arena floor like teeth in a giant mouth. Valeth pursued him with a look of confusion on her scaled face, clearly not understanding why her opponent was fleeing instead of standing to fight like a proper warrior. "Is this how humans face death?" she called out mockingly. "By running like frightened prey animals." Marcus did not answer because he was too busy looking for something he could use. His eyes found it near the eastern wall of the arena, a section where the sand had been disturbed by previous fights and the ground was uneven and treacherous. He led Valeth toward it, letting her get close enough to think she had him cornered before suddenly changing direction and watching as her foot came down on the unstable sand. She stumbled just for a moment, but a moment was all Marcus needed. He spun and drove his makeshift spear toward her exposed side with every ounce of strength in his body. The weapon scraped across her scales and drew a thin line of dark blood before she recovered and knocked him away with a backhand blow that sent him tumbling across the arena. Marcus hit the ground hard and tasted copper in his mouth, but he forced himself back to his feet before she could finish him. The crowd had gone quiet in 300 years of competition. Valeth Sunbane had never been wounded by an opponent. She looked down at the blood on her scales with an expression that might have been shock or might have been the first stirring of something like respect. "You are not what I expected, human." Marcus spat blood onto the sand and raised his bent and battered spear once more. "I get that a lot." The fight continued, and Marcus used every dirty trick he had ever learned or imagined when Valeth cornered him against a pillar. He grabbed a handful of sand and threw it into her eyes when she recovered and came at him with renewed fury. He led her toward another pillar and then dodged at the last second, causing her blade to strike the stone and sending sparks flying through the air. He took wounds that would have killed most species. A deep slash across his ribs that painted his armor red, and a puncture through his left shoulder that made his arm hang uselessly at his side. But he kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing to fall down and die like any sensible creature would have done. The HFY spectators watched in stunned silence as this small, fragile alien continued to defy all expectations, trading blows with their greatest champion and somehow still standing after hits that should have broken him in half. Valeth finally caught him with a sweep of her tail that knocked his legs out from under him. And before he could recover, she was on top of him with her blade pressed against his throat. Her breathing was heavy, and Marcus realized with distant satisfaction that he had actually managed to tire her out. "You cannot win," she said, and her voice was different now, curious instead of contemptuous. "You must know that you cannot win. So why do you keep fighting?" Marcus looked up at her burning eyes and smiled through the blood that covered his face. "Because giving up was never really an option for us." She pressed the blade harder against his skin, drawing a thin line of red. And Marcus did not flinch or look away or beg for mercy. He just kept smiling at her like he knew something she did not. "What are you?" she whispered. And it sounded less like a question and more like she was genuinely trying to understand something that made no sense to her. "I am human," Marcus answered, "and we do not know how to quit." Valeth held him there for a long moment, while the arena waited in breathless silence for her to finish what she had started. Then she pulled her blade away and stood up and turned to face the overseer in his elevated viewing platform. "First blood is mine," she announced to the crowd. "But this human has earned the right to face the second trial." The crowd erupted in confusion and outrage, clearly expecting her to deliver the killing blow that would end this embarrassing display of alien stubbornness. But Valeth ignored them all and looked down at Marcus one more time with something new in her ancient eyes. "You are a strange creature, human, and I find myself wanting to see how much more you can endure before you break." Marcus pulled himself to his feet and stood swaying on the blood-soaked sand, his body screaming with pain but his spirit somehow undiminished. "I guess you will find out." The guards came to collect him and take him to the medical bay, where his wounds would be treated just enough to keep him alive for the next trial. As they dragged him away, Marcus looked back over his shoulder and saw Valeth still standing in the arena, watching him go with an expression he could not quite read. He had survived the first challenge through luck and desperation and sheer, stubborn refusal to die, but the endurance trial was coming, and he had heard enough whispers from other prisoners to know that it was designed to break the spirit as much as the body. The scorching halls waited for him, and somewhere beyond that was the trial of will. And at the end of it all was either freedom for his people or eternal Slavery Marcus closed his eyes and thought about the 43 humans counting on him. About little Maya Webb and her empty stare. About all the reasons he had to keep going when every rational part of his brain was screaming at him to give up. He thought about his grandmother and her stories of survival. About generations of humans who had faced impossible odds and somehow come out the other side. Then he opened his eyes and smiled at the guards who were carrying him to his next torment. So what time does round 2 start? The guards looked at each other in confusion, clearly not understanding how this broken, bleeding creature could still be making jokes, but Marcus understood something that the HFY were only beginning to learn. Humans were not built for victory, they were built for survival, and there was a very important difference between the two. The scorching halls lived up to their name in ways that Marcus had not expected. He stood in a circular chamber carved from dark stone that seemed to radiate heat from every surface, and the air was so hot and dry that each breath felt like swallowing. Fireveilous Sunbane stood on the opposite side of the chamber, her scales gleaming in the red light that poured from vents in the walls, looking as comfortable as if she were standing in a gentle spring breeze. The rules were simple according to the overseer who had explained them with obvious pleasure: no food, no water, no rest for 3 standard days. The first one to collapse or surrender would lose for the HFY. This was practically a meditation retreat, because their cold-blooded bodies were designed for extreme heat and could survive for weeks without water. For every other species, it was a death sentence dressed up as a sporting event. Marcus sat down in the corner of the chamber and tried to conserve as much energy as possible while the heat began its slow work of cooking him from the inside out. The first day passed in a blur of sweat and suffering. Marcus watched Valith perform elaborate combat forms and ritual exercises as if the temperature were perfectly pleasant, moving through ancient warrior dances that had been passed down for generations. She was showing off, demonstrating her superiority, reminding him that this trial was designed for her people and nobody else. He did not respond or react or give her the satisfaction of seeing how much he was struggling. Instead, he closed his eyes and retreated into his own mind, thinking about cold things like snow and ice and the frozen lakes of his childhood home on Earth. The second day was worse. His lips cracked and bled, and his vision started to blur around the edges, and every heartbeat felt like a drum pounding. Inside his skull, Valith continued her exercises without any sign of fatigue, occasionally glancing over at him with what might have been curiosity or might have been the patient attention of a predator waiting for its prey to weaken. Marcus knew he was dying. The human body was not built for this kind of abuse, and he could feel his organs beginning to struggle as dehydration set in, but he also knew that dying was not the same as giving up. And he had made a promise to 43 people who were counting on him, so he stayed in his corner and refused to move and waited for something to change. The change came on the afternoon of the second day when the massive doors of the chamber opened and Overseer Krafthalum entered with a ceremonial procession. Priests in elaborate robes carried a golden vessel filled with water that had been blessed by their war gods. Sacred liquid meant only for HFY champions between trials. The Overseer presented the vessel to Valith with ritual words in their ancient language, praising her endurance and her devotion to the warrior traditions of her people. Valith accepted the vessel with equal ceremony and raised it to her lips. Then she paused and looked across the chamber at Marcus. She lowered the vessel without drinking and walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps, her burning eyes never leaving his face. The Overseer made a sound of approval, clearly thinking she was going to taunt him with what he could not have. Valith stopped in front of Marcus and held the vessel out toward him, not offering it but displaying it, showing him the water that could save his life while making it clear that it would never be his. "Do you see this, human?" she asked in a voice loud enough for the whole chamber to hear. "This is sacred water blessed by our gods and meant only for true warriors. Marcus looked at the vessel and then looked at Valeth, and then did something that nobody in the chamber expected. He reached out and took it from her hands. The motion was so sudden and so unexpected that Valeth did not react in time to stop him, her fingers releasing the vessel before her brain caught up with what was happening. Marcus held the sacred water in his cracked and bleeding hands and looked at the overseer, whose face had twisted into an expression of pure outrage. "Suit yourself," he said to Violithan. He raised the vessel to his lips and drank. The water was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, cool and sweet, and carrying the faint taste of whatever herbs the priests had used to bless. I drank until the vessel was empty, and then let it fall to the stone floor with a clatter that echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. The overseer was screaming about blasphemy and desecration, his voice rising to a pitch that made the walls vibrate. Guards rushed forward with weapons drawn, ready to execute this insolent human who had dared to steal sacred water from a champion of the Dominion. But Valeth raised one clawed hand, and everyone froze in place. She was staring at Marcus with an expression he could not read, her burning eyes wide and her mouth slightly open in what might have been shock, or might have been something else entirely. "You," she said slowly, and her voice was strange, almost wondering. "You just stole the sacred water of our war gods from my hands." Marcus wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked up at her from his position on the floor. "I was thirsty." "That is not," Valeth started to say, and then stopped, and then made a sound that Marcus realized with amazement was laughter. She was laughing at him, or maybe with him, or maybe at the whole absurd situation. "That is not how this works, human. You cannot simply take what you want because you want it." "And yet," Marcus said, gesturing at the empty vessel on the ground, "here we are." The overseer pushed forward, still screaming about punishment and execution, and the ancient laws that demanded death for such an insult. But Valeth turned to face him with a look that made the massive reptile take an involuntary step backward. "This human has done something no one has ever done before," she said, and her voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like admiration. "He has taken what he needed to survive without asking permission or begging for mercy. He has committed blasphemy," the overseer insisted. "The laws are clear. The laws say that the sacred water is for warriors," Valeth replied, "and I am beginning to think that this human might be more of a warrior than anyone in this dominion has ever faced." She turned back to Marcus and studied him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You are either very brave or very stupid." Human Marcus managed to pull himself to his feet, feeling the stolen water already beginning to restore some of his strength. "Honestly, it is probably a little of both." Valeth smiled, and for the first time, it was not the smile of a predator looking at prey. It was the smile of someone who had just discovered something interesting. "I think I am going to enjoy watching you face the final trial," she said. "You continue to surprise me in ways I did not think were possible." The guards retreated, and the overseer stormed out of the chamber, clearly furious but unwilling to challenge Valeth directly. Marcus sat back down in his corner and closed his eyes and allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. He had stolen sacred water from an alien war god and somehow lived to tell the tale. His grandmother would have been proud. The final trial was called Will, and Marcus learned what that meant when they strapped him to a metal chair and attached a neural device to the base of his spine. The device was ancient technology, developed by the Kethvari centuries ago to test the mental strength of their warriors. It delivered pain directly to the nervous system, bypassing the body entirely and flooding the brain with pure agony that escalated every hour until the subject either surrendered or lost consciousness. The current record was held by Valeth Sunbane herself. 14 hours of uninterrupted torment that had cemented her legend as the greatest champion the Dominion had ever produced. Marcus was expected to last maybe 2 hours before his soft human brain gave up. The overseer activated the device with obvious pleasure, his reptilian eyes gleaming with anticipation as Marcus felt the first wave of pain wash through his body. Was bad. It was worse than anything he had ever experienced. Worse than the wounds from the combat trial or the dehydration of the scorching halls. Worse than any injury or illness he had suffered in his entire life. But Marcus had learned something about pain during his time among the Kethvor. Pain was just information, a signal from the body to the brain that something was wrong, and humans had been ignoring that signal for thousands of years. Gritted his teeth and rode the first wave of agony, letting it crash over him like a storm, while he held on to the core of himself like a sailor clinging to a mast. Valith stood watching from across the chamber, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The first hour passed and Marcus did not surrender. The second hour passed and the pain doubled and Marcus still did not surrender. By the third hour, the overseer was pacing nervously, clearly not understanding how this fragile alien was still conscious. Marcus had retreated into his own mind, building walls of memory and determination around the part of himself that mattered most. He thought about Earth and the blue oceans and green forests that he might never see again. He thought about his grandmother sitting by the fire and telling stories about the ancestors who had survived things that should have killed them. He thought about humanity's long journey from caves to starships, every step purchased with blood and sweat and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And then, somewhere around the fourth hour, he started talking. "Do you want to know about humans?" he asked through gritted teeth, his voice cracking but still audible. Valith tilted her head slightly, curious despite herself. "You think this is pain," Marcus continued, forcing each word out past the screaming of his nerves. "Let me tell you about pain." He told her about the Ice Ages, when his ancestors had survived frozen wastelands with nothing but stone tools and animal skins. He told her about the plagues that had swept across continents and killed billions, and how humans had buried their dead and kept going. He told her about the wars they had fought against each other, the famines they had endured, the natural disasters that had wiped out entire civilizations. "My great-grandfather walked 300 miles through a frozen wasteland to escape a death camp," he said during the fifth hour, tears streaming down his face as the pain continued to escalate. "Soldiers hunted him like an animal, and he lost 3 toes to frostbite, and he kept walking because the only other option was to die." Valith had moved closer, drawn in by his words despite the horror of what she was witnessing. "My grandmother survived a plague that killed 2 billion people," Marcus continued. "She watched her parents die, and her siblings die, and her friends die, and she kept living because someone had to remember them." The sixth hour came, and the pain reached levels that should have been impossible to endure. Marcus could barely see through the tears, and his voice had been reduced to a ragged whisper. But he kept talking. "My father rebuilt a colony after an asteroid strike with his bare hands, working 18 hours a day for 3 years until the settlement was stable enough to survive on its own." He looked at Valith through the haze of agony and managed something that might have been a smile. "We are not special," he said. "We are not chosen or blessed or superior in any way that matters. We are just too stubborn to know when we are beaten." His voice broke and his body convulsed as the pain overwhelmed his ability to speak. "We are just," he gasped, "too stupid." Another convulsion. To give up. And then the darkness took him, and he knew nothing more. When Marcus woke, he was lying on a soft surface, and the pain was gone. Opened his eyes, and found himself in a medical bay, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that beeped softly in the quiet. Valith stood at the foot of his bed, watching him with an expression that had changed completely from when they had first met. There was no contempt in her eyes now. No predatory amusement or casual cruelty. There was something that looked almost like wonder. 6 hours. she said. You lasted 6 hours. Marcus tried to speak and found that his throat was too raw to form words. No outsider has ever lasted more than 3, Valeth continued. Most of your species would have been dead within the first hour. She moved closer and sat down in a chair beside his bed, her massive form somehow seeming less threatening than before. You told me about your people, she said quietly. You told me about their suffering and their survival, while the device was tearing your mind apart. Marcus managed a weak nod. I have conquered 17 star systems, Valeth said. And her voice was different now, thoughtful instead of boastful. I have faced warriors from dozens of species and broken them all. She leaned forward and looked into his eyes with an intensity that made him forget about his pain for a moment. But I've never met anything like humans. Marcus found his voice at last. Cracked and barely audible, but still there. Is that good or bad? Valeth considered the question for a long moment. I do not know yet, she admitted. But I think I want to find out. She stood up and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. Rest now, Commander Cole. Tomorrow we learn what the Dominion has decided about your fate. Marcus closed his eyes and let exhaustion pull him back down into darkness. He had survived the 3 trials. Now he just had to hope that it meant something. Marcus woke to the sound of arguing voices echoing through the medical bay. Harsh reptilian syllables that he had learned to recognize as Kethvari speech. He opened his eyes and saw Valeth standing between his bed and the doorway, her body positioned like a wall between him and something on the other. Side Overseer Krathvalum was there with a squad of armed guards. His voice raised in fury as he gestured toward Marcus with one clawed hand. The human failed, the Overseer was saying. He did not complete the trial of will. He collapsed before the required time. By our laws, he and his people belong to the slave pits. Valeth did not move, her voice calm and cold as she responded. He lasted 6 hours against a device that has broken every outsider who ever faced it. He showed more courage and endurance than warriors twice his size. And you want to throw him away like garbage. The law is clear, Krathvalum insisted. Completion requires consciousness until the end of the designated period. Then the law is wrong. The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Marcus had never heard anyone speak to the Overseer that way. And from the shocked expressions on the guards' faces, neither had the Krathavals. Eyes narrowed dangerously. You forget yourself, champion. Even your status does not give you the right to challenge the ancient laws. Valeth took a step forward, and the Overseer involuntarily took a step back. I am invoking the right of acknowledgement, she announced, and her voice carried through the medical bay like a thunderclap. The guards went completely still. Even the Overseer seemed frozen, his mouth open in shock. You cannot, he finally managed to say. That right has not been used in over a century, which means it is still valid, Valeth replied. I acknowledge this human as a warrior worthy of respect. I take personal responsibility for him and his people. And I declare that any challenge to my judgment will be met with the traditional response. She let one hand rest on the hilt of her ceremonial blade. And the meaning was clear. Anyone who wanted to argue would have to fight her. Marcus watched in amazement as the most powerful warrior in the Dominion put herself between him and the system that wanted to destroy him. Overseer looked like he wanted to explode, his scales flushing darker with barely contained rage. The council will hear of this, he hissed. Good, Valeth replied. Let them come. Let them challenge me if they dare. I will be waiting. Krathvalum turned and stormed out of the medical bay with his guards following close behind. And the room fell silent, except for the soft beeping of medical equipment. Valeth turned to face Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. Why? Marcus asked, his voice still rough from the trial. Valeth walked over to his bed and sat down in the chair she had occupied the night before. When I was young, she began. My teachers told me that the HFY were the ultimate warriors, the pinnacle of evolution, destined to rule the galaxy because no other species could match our strength. She looked at her clawed hands as if seeing them for the first time. I believed them. I conquered world after world and crushed every opponent they put in front of me. And I never questioned whether my teachers were right. Her burning eyes found his. Then you arrived. A small soft creature with no natural weapons and no special abilities. And you fought me to a standstill through sheer stubborn refusal to die. She leaned forward. You stole sacred water from my hands and drank it while the overseer screamed for your execution. And you smiled at me like you knew something I did not. Marcus waited for her to continue. You endured pain that would have broken the strongest HFY warrior. And instead of begging for mercy, you told me stories about your people's history of survival. Valeth shook her head slowly. You showed me something I had never seen before. Something that I am still trying to understand. What is that? Marcus asked. Hope, Valeth answered. Hope that there is more to being a warrior than simple victory. Hope that strength can come from places other than muscle and scale and blade. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city of towers and monuments built to celebrate conquest. Your people are free, Commander Cole. All 43 of them will be released and transported back to human space. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. A tension he had been carrying since the moment he was captured finally releasing its grip. Thank you. Valeth turned back to face him. Do not thank me yet. There is something I want in return. Marcus tensed. Waiting for the catch, I want you to go back to your people and tell them about us. Tell them about the HFY Dominion and our warriors and our traditions. She crossed the room and placed something on his chest. And Marcus looked down to see her ceremonial blade, the weapon that had nearly killed him in the arena. Tell them that we are watching. Tell them that we are very interested in what your stubborn, impossible species will do next. Marcus wrapped his fingers around the blade's hilt and felt the weight of everything it represented. And tell them. Valeth continued with something that might have been a smile. That if they ever want to test themselves against the best warriors in the galaxy, the HFY will be waiting. She extended her hand in a gesture that Marcus recognized as the HFY sign of respect between equals. He took it. I will tell them. He promised 1 week later. Marcus stood on the deck of a human transport ship and watched the rust-colored planet of HFY shrink in the viewport. Behind him, the 43 survivors of the diplomatic mission were celebrating their freedom, their voices rising in laughter and tears, as they realized they were actually going home little. Maya Webb was smiling again. Her father held her tight and wept with relief. Dr. Chun was already planning her next research paper about everything she had. Learned Marcus thought about Valeth Sunbane standing in her arena, waiting for the next challenge, wondering what humanity would become. He thought about the stories he would tell when he got home. Stories about an alien warrior who had learned to see humans as something more than prey. He thought about the future and all the possibilities it contained, and somewhere deep in his heart, in the place where his grandmother's stories lived alongside his own memories of survival. Marcus smiled. The galaxy was vast and dangerous and full of species who wanted to conquer or destroy everything they encountered, but humanity had been facing impossible odds since the beginning of their existence, and they had never learned how to quit. Marcus looked down at the ceremonial blade in his hands and made a silent promise to himself and his people. The HFY wanted to see what humans would do next. He intended to show them the end.